Let me tell you about Final Fantasy Tactics. Okay, no, but really, this is Felseal Arbiter's Mark, and this is a game that was made very much to sort of fill in the vacuum that we've experienced for who knows how many poor tortured years square for a new Final Fantasy Tactics, basically. This is an SRPG, strategy RPG, sometimes called Tactics RPGs, who knows why, that has been sort of made as a spiritual successor, something to call back to Final Fantasy Tactics. And so, first of all, there's going to be a lot of comparisons drawn between the two, probably in this video even. But also, they cite some other games as sort of bigger inspirations to it as well, or big inspirations to it, like the Tactics Advanced series and games like Tactics Ogre, which is not related at all to Final Fantasy Tactics in terms of who made it, but it is also really, really good, and I would highly recommend, if you've never heard of those games, to check one of them out. There are several, they all have really weird subtitles, and they're not that hard to find, although you may need to emulate them or something, but anyway, check them out. So what is a Tactics RPG? It is a grid-based, turn-based RPG that uses usually like a sort of isometric or isometric-like perspective, this sort of slanted projection. And it's generally very difficult. A lot of these games are quite hard, and they involve a lot of class and character building to come up with very specific teams to combat certain groups of enemies, whether they be beasts or human enemies. Usually the humans are the harder of the two because of all the crazy things they can do, just like you can. But in this case, we're looking at a game that is very class-based, as in, you know, there are lots and lots of classes to choose from, and they all have very individualized roles. There are about 25 or so classes in this game. That also includes things, for instance, like character-specific classes, where because of certain story events, a character actually gets a class that only they can have, and also sort of hidden classes that you can unlock in different ways. Like usually you have to find or craft these medals to actually gain access to these classes. For instance, there is a lunar medal that isn't too hard to obtain that will get you the werewolf class, but I'm not going to spoil how any of that works or anything like that, but hopefully that will pique your interest. There's also a tremendous amount of variety in the equipment here, because as well as actually having a specific class, you need the equipment that goes along with it to actually, well, be good enough, because generally speaking, there are lots and lots of classes in these games that are very item dependent, and then there are a couple that are actually just kind of good no matter what. That's often just how these work. You'll find tons of classes that need certain items to actually make themselves more powerful, and then there are some that, just because of the ability set that they have, they're just generally really effective anyway. Oftentimes like a monk-like class, or just straight up monks from Final Fantasy Tactics, very much fit that role of not being very item dependent, and they're just good as it is. So classes are very important to the whole experience of one of these sorts of games, and in this case, it does go the very much the Final Fantasy Tactics route, by which I mean a lot of the mechanics involving classes are very familiar if you've actually played that game. It even has the class wheel, the very classic class wheel that all of those, that Final Fantasy Tactics had. Every time you go to switch a class in the camp menu, it's all in this big wheel. And unlocking classes, the other ones that aren't specific like that, work in the same way, where you have to have a character with certain classes of certain levels to actually unlock new ones. You know, they'll say, like, you need a Knight level 3 and a Scoundrel level 3 to unlock this one, things like that. And the way that the leveling works, though, is a little bit more specific in this case. In something like Final Fantasy Tactics, you had character levels and you had job levels. Character levels were obtained by actually getting experience in fights, and the job levels were obtained by getting enough job points by doing actions to pass a specific threshold that would actually level you up. In Felseal, it's a bit different in that the skills are actually in a skill tree rather than a skill list, like in Final Fantasy Tactics, where you could just sort of pick the ones that you wanted. In this case, you actually have a tree that you have to go down in a specific order, and you only choose the ones that you can access right now, depending on what part of the tree that you're in. And instead, you get just AP that you spend to purchase these, and then the actual level of the class will go up for each that you buy. So if you have, 9 of the 11 skills, then you'll have a level 9 whatever class that is. And that's actually a pretty cool system, because it means that you get to sort of feel stronger and stronger as the class levels up almost no matter what kind of class it is, because you'll be purchasing abilities that are farther down a tree and sort of more exclusive that way. And there are also masteries, just like in Tactics and other games like that, where if you get all of the skills, you will master that class, and that character will then obtain a sort of permanent stat boost, very much dependent on the class in question that was actually mastered. Different classes have a different mastery bonus, but they stay permanent to that character no matter what other class they decide to choose next, which is nice. Now, the actual strategy here, of course, is that you have to equip classes that work together and that matter together and form a team that actually makes sense. And in this case, it is actually very reminiscent of Tactics and Tactics Advance, in that you will have a singular class that character currently is using right now and is getting levels right now by using it, and then the two passive abilities that they can have. Every class will have, well, most classes will have two passive abilities on a tree that they can access. You will then also be able to equip one other skill set of a different class that character has unlocked, and be able to use all of the abilities within it that they have bought so far. And then two other passives that they can choose from all of the passives that they have purchased for all the other classes they have, as well as, finally, a counter ability, something that they will do upon getting hit by something. Anything from just a basic counterattack to countering with a non-elemental version of a magic spell to getting Renew, which is basically regen. It makes their health regenerate at the end of the turn. Things like that. And that means that the actual character building in this game is very much like Tactics. It's very complicated. It's quite a complex thing because of all the different stat growths and masteries and combinations of different skills, or skill sets, I should say, from each class that you can actually combine together and sort of tie off with that counter ability. It's really fun in that aspect. People that really like in-depth role-playing in terms of video game versions will definitely appreciate the depth that systems like this have, and in this case they have pulled it off very, very well, and it's certainly very depthy. And of course there's also the equipment aspect, and the equipment does the thing that it does in games like Tactics, and that it's not really a like a linear progression where the first early game pieces of equipment are, you know, so powerful, and then the ones after that are a little bit more powerful, and then they just keep sort of climbing this hill. The early game equipment just starts as sort of jack of all trades, generally good, but not good at any particular thing in a major way, just, you know, acceptable, and then goes out into sort of specialization niche territory after that, where you have lots of elemental weapons that all do the same amounts of damage, so you want to choose the right one for the right opportunities. Lots of armors and shields that protect you against specific elements and specific status effects, of which there's a huge grid of them in this game. There are lots of status ailments. And that makes, in my opinion, the actual building of a character just very interesting, to have all of those different combinations and all those different options, and there are lots and lots of options, with, of course, each class being able to use different kinds of weapons, different kinds of armors, and being suitable for use with all sorts of different bits of other classes. There are various skill sets, and you also have the stat growths that I mentioned. Every time you level up as a character, it works exactly the same as in Final Fantasy Tactics, where no matter what level you are, you always need 100 XP to level up, and every time you do an action, like, you know, smack something or cast a spell or what have you, you will gain XP, and that will go towards your character level, dependent on the level of the things that you're using it on. Oftentimes depends on how much you're using. This is very different from lots of other RPGs where, you know, you have to fill an experience meter that gets bigger and bigger each time you level up. In this case, it's always 100. It's just that you have to be fighting characters and monsters that are around your level to keep getting good amounts of experience. But yes, every time you level up as a character, your stats will go up as in a specific amount dependent on the class that you're currently maining at the time. So, although pretty much anyone can turn into any class as long as they have it unlocked, there are certain aspects of this that make it cogent for you to pay attention to what the stat growths are, and luckily in this game it actually just straight up tells you on the class selection screens what the stat growths for everything are, and that's all very transparent information that you always have access to, and I really, really like that, to be honest. I think that's a great way to do it. So, you know, a character that has leveled up in a sort of speedy, stabby, stealthy, daggery class for a very long time will have stats related to that, and perhaps might not be really, really good as like a frontline tank, even if they choose the knight class. So things like that. It's a lot to consider, but if you're used to gameplay like this, then it fits into place very nicely, and it all has a really good place in actually making the combat complex and satisfying without it being, you know, obtuse, basically. There are also some other important differences, like, for instance, the way that consumables work in this game. Instead of going to a shop and buying potions and what have you, you actually have a specific number, so it'll say, like, you know, potion 2. But that doesn't mean that you have 2 potions available. That means you have 2 to use in this battle, and then you won't be able to use anymore, but you'll automatically refresh to 2 outside of the battle. So it's more like a supply, a continuously refreshing supply of consumables, than something that you actually buy. Shops, instead, are relegated to gear for the most part, and it does use the familiar try and buy system where you can go in and equip any of your given characters with the gear that you want, with the red names of the gear sort of denoting the stuff that you need to purchase before leaving, because it's the stuff that you've put on characters new from the shop. Very familiar, very useful, especially for arming lots and lots of characters, and brand new characters that are recruited in this game in the same way that you were probably familiar with by going to a guild, selecting their class, their level, and all that stuff, and there's quite a bit of customization for how they look, which is nice. However, there is now a crafting system in the game that allows you to get various components, various bits and bobs, either from enemy drops from stealing with the Scoundrel class, or from chests and things like that, for crafting either uses of consumables, because that's how it works now. Instead of crafting individual potions and the like, you actually say, you know, go from 3 to 4 potions, so you'll have 4 to use every single battle. And the interesting thing about the consumable crafting is that not only does it give you an extra use, but it also tends to upgrade them. So for instance, if you have 2 potions, they'll usually be restoring like 50 HP apiece, but if you craft a third one, all of them are going to be at 75 now. So this is kind of interesting in that it makes consumables a little more viable in this game, in my opinion, because you'll always have some, since they don't go away. They're just refreshed at the start of battle. And also that they will sort of scale with you in a sense, making them just in general more useful for longer. And there are also some other things you can craft, like gadgets for the Gadgeteer, a class that uses these crafted bits and bobs to actually make their abilities work, which is pretty fun, and even gear for yourself, some of which is gear that I haven't actually found in shops yet, and oftentimes if it is gear that you can find in shops, it's earlier than you can buy it, basically, and of course, you don't have to spend money on it. And that's also, of course, as usual with the chests, which is very important to find in each area. The chests will tend to have gear and items that you can't actually normally find commonly yet, which is pretty cool. There's also the interesting thing that now chests actually remain. There are harvest points and chests in any sort of battle grid, and the chests will stay there, so if you didn't get them during a story mission, you can actually go back and get them later. And then there are harvest points for various crafting components that you can find in a lot of the maps, and they will respawn at the beginning of each new battle, so you can sort of farm the crafting components that way. Art style-wise, although it does, you know, it does lack the sort of chibi charm that Final Fantasy Tactics had, it is a really nice art style in and of itself. It does stand on its own. And it's kind of cool that everything is hand-drawn. You can tell even like animated things like water, even the particle effects for spells and hits and the like, all those are drawn, which gives it a pretty unique appearance that I actually appreciate quite a bit. Although no running in place, sadly. And I've got to say the story is actually quite nice and involved as well. It's definitely interesting and has kept me wanting to see what happens next. I mean, Final Fantasy Tactics was a game that had a fantastic story, sometimes unexpectedly so, with some really good lines and some really interesting moments, and it was actually a pretty adult story for the time. So obviously if you're going to be calling back to those games, then you've got a bit of a job on your hands when it comes to the story department, and this one's actually genuinely interesting. Also, I would say that for a lot of people, when you actually think back to playing those games, you probably don't just think of the, like, you know, the basic battle maps where you just had to kill everything to win, although it's always good to have a lot of those because they're fun. But I would wager that a lot of people actually think more towards the story moments and the special objective maps that had things that you had to do that weren't just kill everything. They were to kill a very specific enemy when you were surrounded by much harder things, or to get to certain squares on the map for certain events to happen at a certain time before something even worse happened, things like that. And this game definitely understands that. It understands how to do all of that well, and it does it quite well. A lot of the maps have a lot of that variety. In fact, I would just say that the game understands how to stand out. And although it is very reminiscent of Final Fantasy Tactics, even if you haven't played that and don't really care, it still stands on its own and is not trying to ape something so hard that it actually sort of pales in comparison compared to it and doesn't have enough of its own identity. It's very far from that, actually. It's a very good strategy RPG, even if you know nothing about the lineage that it sort of, the thoughts of it come from. This game will be available today or tomorrow, depending on when this video goes up. The 30th, basically. By the time that my internet decides to cooperate, it'll probably be already out or about to be, depending on where you live. And I would highly suggest getting into it, because it's a very good game that is reminiscent of other very good games without leaning so much on them that without them it just sort of falls over and doesn't know what to do with itself. It is an excellent strategy RPG from what I've played so far, and I'm definitely going to probably play through it because, well, I miss the tactics games, and having games like this that know what they're doing is very important. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.